So much, Libby, for being willing to talk to us. And this is one of the best things about the pandemic is Zoom. So we're glad to have you here all the way from New York. I had a great pleasure reading your book, and really, not only did I enjoy it for myself, but I know I'm going to be sending it to family members. We do have it here at the library for Gail Borden Library card holders. It's available on Hoopla. It's in print, it's in ebook, and in e-audio. And it's just extremely well researched and written. So tell us where, if people are interested in buying the book, where they can get it.
Yeah. So yeah, your local library, obviously, always start there, right? It's recently out on paperback. And so you can get it wherever you get your books, right? Amazon is the usual place where people go. And it's always cheaper there. But I also wanted to put in a plug for a website called bookshop.org, which supports independent booksellers. So if you're concerned about independent booksellers keeping their doors open during the pandemic, go to bookshop.org. In general, to buy books. And the nice thing is, like, they'll still ship it to you, but it's from a local bookstore, right? And then I also work with an independent bookstore near my house to offer signed copies of the book, and they'll ship to Illinois and everywhere. So I'm going to throw that all into the chat, and if people are interested in whatever, they can certainly go to the bookstore near my house, which is called the Village Bookstore in Pleasantville, New York. So yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. So tell us a little bit. You put in so much research, and I love the way you took factual information or things that are real issues today and wove them in with, stories, people's true stories that, and tell us what was the impetus that made you want to write this book?
Yeah. So I've been a journalist for over 20 years, and I've always thought it's such an incredible privilege to be able to tell people's stories. And the kinds of stories I like to tell are the stories that are quite immersive, where I spend a lot of time with someone and I understand to sort of to the extent that I can as an outsider, kind of how their world is shaped and how they see things, and kind of, get to tell their story. And I'm sort of the belief that we all have really compelling stories, and the kinds of stories I like to tell are, more kind of like ordinary person in extraordinary circumstances, rather than I've done celebrity profiles, I've done political profiles, I've done artists, and that's great. But I really think that when you can tell a story that no one's ever heard before, and you can sort of, elucidate our common humanity and make us understand one another, that to me is like one of the most amazing things that journalism can do. So, I've been interested for a long time in how technology shapes us, and how certain technologies we don't quite anticipate the way they're going to play out the way they do, right? And I was especially interested in home DNA testing a few years ago as an example of that, because home DNA testing, which has been around a while but has really gotten quite popular the last few years with the genealogical craze, it's something where there's a certain group of people who take a test and they get a result, they get an answer to a question they didn't even realize they were asking. Right. So there's a number of people, not the majority of people, but a significant minority of people who take a home DNA test because they're just idly curious. And they suddenly discover, for instance, that, oh my gosh, I am not genetically related to my dad. Right. And it's like, you're not really prepared at all for that. Right. You go in thinking you're just going to find out how Italian you are, and you get this instead. And it's like, well, what then? And actually the what then is it really often changes people's lives in quite profound ways. And I was so interested in exploring that. So I was in conversation with my editor at the Washington Post newspaper, and we decided to write, basically like a cover story about the phenomenon. And so that came out about 4 years ago. And what happened is that then I got this flood of reader email from people who'd read the story from basically all over the country, and even abroad in the UK and elsewhere. And people wanted to share their stories because they understood that this was a new phenomenon, and they weren't seeing, their stories kind of like elsewhere. They weren't seeing this kind of normalized and validated. They felt alone. right? And when occasionally they would see a representation of it in the media, that really resonated with them. And then they wanted to share it, right? And they wanted to go really deep. And I was reading these emails. I started like calling people who had emailed me and talking to them on the phone, and occasionally winding up in tears because their stories were so moving, because these are life-changing surprises or revelations. Because, you know, the kind of the basic lesson of all this is that the past isn't really over, right? It lives inside of us. And the decisions that our parents made, and sometimes our grandparents, and even before them, you know, to do certain things, those things shape us, and they shape us even when we don't know it. And so when we make a discovery, for instance, that our own parents aren't who we thought, it explains a lot of things, and it really kind of changes how we see ourselves. And that's a journey that can go on for a really long time. And so I wanted to kind of follow that, right? So the impetus for The Last Family started with these emails, and then talking to people, and then realizing, you know, that we were entering a new era that had a lot of implications for family and questions around identity and ethnicity, and all these other things. And that it was also representing a moment where family secrets are over because DNA testing is revealing them. And it's kind of a new world, right? We're going to look back on this, I think, as a really pivotal time. And I wanted to kind of document what we were going through.
Thank you. We do have a comment to that. One of our participants says, I ran into a gentleman who told me he recently found out that neither of his grandfathers are genetically related to him.
Yeah.
So
and I mean, yeah.
you start out your book with a story about Alice.
Yeah.
And that kind of relates to this. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I wanted to tell a lot of stories, but I wanted to have a central narrative, like a single plot that you would kind of follow through the book, and then you could peel off and hear some other stories. But I wanted there to be like one character, one true person, that was compelling enough to kind of carry you through a book that I feel is quite, this is really has far-reaching consequences about identity. And so I wanted a story that was really like weighty and important and compelling, so that, you could sort of be like, what's happening next, right? And my model for it was fiction, because this is journalism, but my model is like Agatha Christie mysteries, right? Because why? Because number one, I love reading thrillers and whodunits, but also like when you discover something surprising in your DNA results, you basically become a detective. A lot of people suddenly get bitten by the bug and they're like, what? And then they start researching, and then they're basically trying to answer the question of who am I? And I thought that, the model of detective fiction was actually quite a good one for these true stories of DNA discovery. So, Alice is the person who carries us through the book. She's this woman that we meet in about 10 years ago. And she's retired, and she's this really, really smart, scientific-minded woman. And she's doing her genealogy, and she comes from a background where she believes herself to be completely Irish American. And she takes a DNA test, and this is kind of like a while ago, so the results are kind of crude, and she's not sure what to expect, but it seems to be telling her that she's not entirely Irish American. It seems to be telling her that she's half Ashkenazi Jewish, which is, Jews from Central and Eastern Europe. And so she thinks, well, that's like, they just don't know what they're doing, right? These are early days. I'll just take a test with another company. So she tests with another company. The second company results confirm the first company's results. And that's when she realizes she has a mystery on her hands. And she goes about investigating it in this very methodical way, because Alice is like really quite, controlled about it. She can look at her own situation with the kind of mind of a scientist, and she can say, okay, I thought I was completely Irish American. I'm half Ashkenazi Jewish. The likeliest explanation is I must not be related to my dad. And her dad is no longer alive at this point. And she's pondering this with like a lot of like a heavy heart, because she loved him very much. And they were very close. So now, why would you not be related to your dad? And a lot of people are discovering there's a number of ways that that can happen. I mean, one way is perhaps your mom has a relationship with somebody other than the man you consider dad, right? Maybe outside the marriage, maybe he comes along after you're conceived and you're just a baby and you don't know it, and this is your stepfather, but they call him your father and you don't find out till later. Another scenario is that your donor conceived. So when people are having trouble conceiving, right, they might use a sperm donor. And there were many generations when people said not to tell their children. Basically, experts said, don't tell your child they're donor conceived. That was the received wisdom, and that's what people did. And it's now no longer the case that that's the best. We understand that that's not the best thing to do, and that's not common practice anymore. So Alice thinks that maybe she's one of these things, right? She's not related to her dad because of one of these reasons. And when she investigates it, she's able to disprove that theory. But it's kind of surprising because for a lot of people, if they find out that their ethnicity estimate, this pie chart that you get when you take a home DNA test, is half unexpected, that would be a really likely explanation for them. And what Alice does is she keeps investigating all the theories and she keeps getting more and more far-fetched. So she starts with the likeliest scenario, and then she goes on to the possibilities she's adopted, which seems really unlikely, and she disproves it. And then she has a theory where maybe she comes from a group of people who hid their genetic ancestry to escape discrimination, which has happened historically. She disproves that. And then she has some really wacky theories involving her grandparents. Those don't prove to be true. And ultimately, I won't say what happens, but she uncovers the truth after literally going at this problem for 2.5 years. It's insane. It's like a full-time job for her. And it's completely surprising, the explanation, and it's rooted in a mystery that is 100 years old. So it's it was kind of this gift to be able to do this historical research going back a century. But the reason I liked Alice's story is because, you are what you don't see it coming. You can't believe that this is the explanation. But the other thing is, because she is so methodical and she investigates all these theories, it kind of gives me a chance to peel off and tell a lot of those stories, which are more sort of common because her situation is quite unusual. But, I can peel off and do an entire chapter about people discovering that they're not genetically related to dad and how those situations play out from the point of view of them and their siblings and their genetic father and the man they call dad, who's not genetically related to them. And that kind of 360, people discovering they're adopted and they didn't know it. Because of a DNA test, people discovering that their families did hide their genetic ancestries and now they're rethinking who they are. So, these are all these incredible American stories that are arising right now as a result of DNA testing. And Alice's story kind of gets us along the road to hearing a lot of those stories.
Yeah, it really was like a mystery thriller. And it was a surprise ending. I would not have, I kept thinking, oh, she's going to find out that she's going to find it. No. And at the end, it was just, oh my gosh, that could happen. So we don't want to spoil the ending for anyone. So, when you're talking about the DNA testing and on so many levels, I mean, you get into a lot of implications for society. But why do we take those tests? So some of us are curious. Mm-hmm. Some of us have medical interest, we want to find out, are we going to, get this or that? Or do we have these variants? And one of the things that was a surprise was to learn that it is a very common holiday gift.
Yeah.
That's their big time. Can you give someone a gift over the holidays and expect them to put their spit in and who controls that information?
Yeah, it's really fascinating because a couple of decades ago, it would have been unthinkable that for that price, with that ease in that little time, that you could find out so much information about your genetic material, and that, all the kind of privacy concerns that we had 20 years ago, that this would become basically just a thing that you could buy, right? And that it's not considered medical information, so it's not protected, right? That's crazy, or would have been seemed really crazy to people 20 years ago. It's kind of a funny market that's arisen. The concept is that this is recreational DNA testing, right? So that's the word for this market. And what does recreational mean? It means that this is very different from what you're doing when you go like to a doctor's office and you want to know if you're a carrier for a certain disease because you're thinking of having children, right? And you want to make sure you and your spouse aren't going to contribute the possibility of a particular disease for a future child, right? That is a completely different setup, right? There's privacy protections for that. That information is given to you in the context of a doctor's visit. It's kind of explained all the risks and, what you may find and what it all means, and you can kind of get coached on it. This is totally different. And that comes from a particular genealogical curiosity in America, and it comes from a fervor for genealogical inquiry. It comes from a nation where a lot of people are descended from immigrants, and very often immigrants who assimilated their ways out of their identities. And so people are picking up their heads in 2021 and saying, like, where is my grandfather from? I don't even know. Right. And there's a lot of Americans who suddenly, and, we're responding to cultural cues and cultural pressures, but we suddenly have this kind of sense that if we understood our past better, we would understand our present. And you see that coming in all different places. You see it from memoirs, you see it from TV shows, you see it, finding your roots on PBS and who do you think you are? And we just are in this moment of family history kind of fervor, and there's more records available now through companies and also free services that offer all these indexed kind of archival, records, right? So, there's literally never been a better time to get into genealogy. And then you have certain interest groups, right? You have people, for instance, who set out with a very specific question, right? They never knew the identity of their genetic father. And they can't find out, their mom won't tell them their mom's not alive. There is literally now this means of finding out the answer to a question that in the past you could have lived and died and never known the answer to, and it's DNA testing. So you have people who have a very specific question, right? Sometimes it's a kind of a genealogical question. Who was my great grandfather? And sometimes it's a more immediate question, like I was adopted and the state that I live in doesn't permit me to access my original birth certificate, so I can't know the names of my birth parents. I'm going to take a DNA test, right? Or I was donor conceived. What is the identity of my donor father? And do I have any siblings out there? Oh my gosh, I have 10, so those kind of, and then you have the casual consumer. And that's what you're talking about when you're talking about this as a holiday gift. And that's literally how I got my first DNA test kit, was as a gift from my father for the holidays in late 2016. And that is the biggest growth in this field. So when I started writing the book 4 years ago, there were 8 million DNA test kits that had been sold by the 4 major companies that existed at the time. Now there are close to 40 million DNA test kits sold. So more than quadrupled in the last 4 years. And a lot of those people are people who just saw an ad on TV and they're like, or, they got it as a gift. And that means they don't often know even what they're getting in that information, because the cost is so low that you don't really have to, it's such a small investment for many people, especially if it's on sale. It could be as little as $50. And so they just kind of, and they're often uniquely unprepared when those surprises kind of come, or, they may not even know kind of what they're giving up or what, what they're consenting to.
We have a couple interesting comments in the chat I'm going to read here. So far, I've been fortunate to have fairly good experiences with with DNA testing. My grandmother was adopted. The testing disproved her long-held theory of who her bio father was, which made her a bit sad. But then I was eventually able to discover her true paternal family. We found some amazing newspaper articles and photos to show her before she passed. Sicilian, not Irish. Who knew?
Love it.
And here's another one. I have another friend who gave his dad a DNA kit for Christmas. His dad was livid, very upset. He refused to use it. Come to find out much later that his dad had mumps as a child and was sterile. and he was fathered by another man intentionally with both his parents' approval.
Yeah, I mean, so these are pretty incredible stories, right? And the thing that strikes me is, we have, a handful of people on here, and just among the folks who are here, right, we have these like remarkable stories that frankly, each one of them could be like a book, right? With all the everything that kind of comes with it, right? And I think, and what do I mean by that? I mean that it is a really big thing to look in the mirror and suddenly realize that you don't recognize your face because you don't know who handed you half of your genetic material. That is a really big deal. And I know that because, not because it happened to me, but because I've interviewed hundreds of people to whom it has happened. And over people said, it has changed my life forever. Some people expressed it as a trauma. Some people expressed it as a blessing. Sometimes it was both painful and also good, like bittersweet. And that's why that's why my book has this subtitle, How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are, because the thing is that now there's no such thing, or very soon won't be. There's no such thing as like a person who does not know their truth about their genetic origins. And it actually really shifts, kind of how the generations communicate with each other. Because a parent can't assume anymore that their child won't know just because they didn't tell them, because it's not up to them. The power of that knowledge is no longer in the hands of that parent anymore. The power of understanding oneself and where one came from now rests with the person who takes a DNA test, or even sometimes you don't even have to take a DNA test to make these discoveries. So, that means that we're entering a completely different world. And it also means that there's a lot of people with, some pretty big kind of feelings, right? In many ways, it's a mental health crisis, frankly. Because this is recreational DNA testing and there's not a lot of controls, right? So people make these discoveries and then it's like, there's no like real support for them. They wind up going onto Facebook groups to get the support that they need from other people who've had these experiences. So to me, this is a huge, big deal that we need to be talking about much more, because we can't talk about it enough, because it affects so many people. And it's such a big deal. It's so disorienting and numbing and shocking to make this kind of discovery.
That makes me think of one of the stories in your book that you share about Rosario. So he thinks he's Italian.
Yeah.
And turns out he has an African-American background. And then you also talk about, the concerns surrounding the Indigenous American communities. Would you talk a little bit about those two aspects?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, identity is both biological and not biological, right? Is it both about genes and it is not about genes? And that is one of the kind of difficult things to talk about, because everyone defines for themselves what these results mean for them, right? I mean, if you grew up and your entire life you identified as something, and then you discover because of a DNA test that you're actually something else, like Alice, for instance, is she Irish or is she Jewish? Right. And that she might answer that question differently depending on whether you're asking her about it in the context of her ethnicity or her spirituality. Right. Because that's an extra complication and wrinkle for her. Alice comes from a large Irish Catholic family. And I can tell you that every one of her siblings feels differently about how they would answer that question. So that tells you, right, that there is not one answer. And that when we get overly kind of, I would say reductive about like, well, your ethnicity is just what's your genes. That's not true. But it's also not just your lived experience, because particularly if it depends how you find out and why you didn't know in the first place. But with the story of like Rosario, for instance, the reason he thought he was Sicilian is because his mom, who was biracial, by the way, told him he was Sicilian, because having grown up as a biracial child in a rural community and white community in Vermont, she knew how crummy it was to be subjected to racism all the time, right? To be different. And when she grew up, she realized she could pass as white. And so she had these two boys, and she was basically of the mind that they were never going to experience what she experienced. She wasn't going to subject them to that kind of discrimination. So she told them they were Sicilian. And Rosario was somebody who was always looking for himself through his understanding of his past. So he really like embraced that Italian identity, like in a major league way. So that when he takes a DNA test and gets into genealogy when he's in his early 50s, it's so much more of a shock and a letdown because he is so tied to that Italian identity. Like he's actually literally legally changed his name to an Italian name, right? And he's also learned to sing Italian opera, and he's also converted to Catholicism, and he's also married an Italian American woman after flying her to Italy to propose, right? So he's fully Italian, but actually he's not Italian. And what this does for him, this revelation, I mean, it explains a lot of things. It allows him to go to his mom and have a conversation, and a series of conversations that explains his family to him. It allows him to get to know his African-American cousins. It gives him, I mean, it is painful, but it is also like an incredible gift that would not have happened without DNA testing, right? So what it gives him back is his family and his identity, and it gives him a kind of a deeper, more complex knowledge of all the things that, you know, the truth about America's past and the things that America kind of did to his family and families like his, the kind of theft that was, you know, that was enacted, but also now he gets this, like, he gets to reclaim it, right? So that's kind of amazing, right? And Rosario was somebody I talked to over and over the course of several years, to you know, say, how does this evolve? How do you think of yourself? What do you call yourself now? And over time, he would change in his identity. Even he wound up legally changing his name again. Like he really struggled. And I would say you know, maybe he's still a work in progress. I'm not sure, but you know, I think we all are, right? Works in progress. And this is very much something that he is working with in terms of how he thinks about himself and his world and where he comes from. That's the kind of, you know, that's the kind of the bigness that I'm talking about when I'm talking about the you know, the various influences that we have and sort of how we identify ourselves in all these different ways, is the way that a DNA test and the understanding of the truth can really kind of then also shape us, you know, in the present tense and even going into the future, which is pretty amazing.
And then with, you know, you talk about in your book about the Indigenous Americans and how some of them have rejected the idea that DNA makes them who they are, that there's so much more to their identity.
So that's right. So that's the kind of nuance about it, is also that, you know, many Indigenous American people and communities see themselves as identified as who they are, in part because of their relationships and their lived experience. So it is not about genes, right? Genes seems overly simplistic. And also as a kind of a political category, that's not how they're defined as far as like the government is concerned. They don't test themselves and establish their DNA in order to establish membership in an Indigenous American community, right? That's not how they. So, and then you add to it the history of, you know, skepticism about the scientific community and genetic research on Indigenous Americans because of frankly, medical exploitation of this group. And you can understand why there's a great deal of mistrust. So there, a lot of folks, you know, their basic approach is like, whatever your definition is, my definition is my definition, right? Whatever scientific community, whatever your pie chart is, right? Like my definition, I know who I am. I know how I grew up. I know kind of the community that I grew up with and the history, the oral history that, you know, we cherish. And you know, that is sacred. And, you know, this pie chart is nothing in relation to that. So that, I mean, those are two stories that go kind of, I guess, at cross purposes, right? Rosario found a lot of meaning in his DNA, and some Indigenous Americans kind of reject that as a means to identity. And I think both things are true, because there is this, at once, this moment of great opportunity to understand the past. And there's also this danger, and I talk about this a lot in the book, of being overly, you know, what they call essentialist about your DNA, reading too much into it, thinking of ourselves as quite different or defined by it, thinking of the genes as something that can kind of like predict your fate or tell your future, when in fact, like, it's much more complex than that. And identity is more complex than just biology alone.
Yeah. So you use the term tipping point. So now we have more than 37 million people who have taken the home DNA tests. And in America, at least in this country, maybe not true worldwide, you use the term we're at a tipping point. Can you tell us more about what you mean?
Yeah, so the tipping point is a kind of a way of saying that, we are at the point where, because there's so many people in the databases and because most of those people are American, that the majority of the US population is actually represented by these databases, even though the majority of the population has not taken a DNA test. What do I mean by that? I mean that even though you haven't taken a test, for instance, if you haven't, you have cousins who have, people you may know or people you may not know. And those people share genetic material with you. And so when they took a test, they essentially opted in on your behalf. And that means that you are, it's possible that you may discover something about your family or yourself, or your health history or your roots, through DNA testing, even though you never took a test yourself. What do you mean? I don't get to opt out? No, you don't. In some sense, you don't. You mean I'm not invisible? That's right. You're not invisible. It means that many, 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 many more people are potentially identifiable despite never having taken a DNA test than we realize. Because if you have third cousins in the database, which at this point most of us do, you are potentially identifiable to someone who is closely genetically related to you and searching for you, even if you haven't taken a test. So what does that mean? It means that there's no such thing as an anonymous sperm donor anymore. Period, full stop. A person in their 40s looking for their genetic father can take a test, can discover their identity of their genetic father, often with not too much effort, even though he's never taken a test. It means that many, many, many people who are adopted can find the identities of the birth parents now. And so those laws that restrict them, while certainly meaningful on a certain level, in terms of civil rights and human rights, are not meaningful in terms of barring that information from people. It opens up a lot of conversations about the reality of the American family. It opens up a lot of conversations about the taboos of the past and the way we kind of behaved as if, families were only shaped a certain way, and anyone who behaved differently was sort of, on the margins. In fact, families have always kind of been shaped in these different ways, and, a mix of biology and non-biological members, and that kind of ideal of the nuclear family that we all kind of were browbeaten into believing, right, that it had to be that way. It's actually never been that way. And now we're at this moment where we're kind of, facing that. We're kind of like having to accept that the family, the true shape of it, and in all its variation. Somebody, I think.
Yeah, we've got do you want to, yeah.
Should I read it out loud?
Sure, yeah, that'd be great.
The thing about all peoples living from the Mediterranean area of the world, including Italy and Sicily, of course, is that there's a lot of intermixing of genes, including African genes, over thousands of years. It's interesting that Rosario was so shocked and seemed to feel that his DNA results were at odds with an Italian heritage. I mean, if you take us back far enough, obviously we all come out of one place and we all come out of Africa. The DNA tests are looking at your heritage from 500 to 1,000 years ago. And he was shocked because, in fact, his grandfather was Black and he was not Italian. So, that's different than saying, I found 2% of something mixed in, because there was a lot of intermixing of populations. This is kind of a radically different scenario. He believed he was Italian because of a fiction his mother told him. And in fact, his grandfather was Black and his grandmother was white, and they had a biracial child. And that child, her family was destroyed by a system that incarcerated that Black grandfather for that relationship, for the crime of that relationship. And to protect that, to protect her sons, she kept that truth from him. So that's the epiphany for Rosario was that he now could kind of get back that identity that kind of had been taken from him and taken from his mother. And that meant, I guess, kind of like a new, like almost like a rebirth for him, which is kind of beautiful, I think.
There were some really, really amazing stories of people coming together because of the, as you call them, the seekers finding each other. And then also some stories of rejection and hardship. But one of the things I want to go down the rabbit hole to is how this DNA, talk about the Golden State Killer and other crimes, and how this DNA is now being used and applied in ways with or without permission.
Yeah. So basically, this is like the use of DNA in genetic genealogy databases or consumer databases, or gathered for consumer purposes. That is being used to solve crimes that are as old as sometimes 50, 60 years. And they're often murders, and they're often, or sexual assaults, right? Something where the person left their DNA. And maybe at some point the police ran that DNA through their law enforcement databases, but it didn't produce a hit because those are really limited in a number of ways. And then it was cold for a really long time, right? So what the kind of revelation of doing what's called investigative genetic genealogy is that you could use the same principle that allows an adopted person to find their birth mother, even if she's never taken a DNA test. You could do that with crime scene DNA. And you could do it with crime scene DNA from 1975. You could make it look like the same DNA that I spit into a vial when I send it into Ancestry, that you could make it kind of read in the same way, like, because there are different ways of analyzing DNA. So it's kind of like you make it take the same kind of, accept the same form of analysis. You match the profile. And then you feed it into one of these databases and you match it up with a bunch of third cousins. And then you do genealogy and other research to identify that DNA and say, oh my gosh, it's this guy in his 80s who's living in California, a quiet life, a retired police officer. He actually raped 50 women and murdered 13 people. That's the Golden State Killer. That actually happened, right? And he was arrested in spring of 2018. And that was the first case of someone being arrested in this way after as a result of it. What happened is that these databases were being used, some of the private databases that companies were running were being used in this way, sometimes without the permission of the company itself, because there can be backdoor ways of getting in depending on the company, and sometimes with the permission of the company, but without the consent or knowledge of the consumers. So you can see how this world is a bit of a Wild West. There's these sort of stringent protections for, your medical DNA when you get it tested in the context of a doctor's office. And then there's these kind of like this other world of recreational DNA, and the protections are totally different. And sometimes that means that a detective can solve a case in a particular way without the company itself even knowing, which is like pretty amazing. And that prompted a lot of soul searching and privacy debates and civil liberties concerns. And so now we're in this place where these cases are being solved in this way. And there's not a ton of regulation around it, but there's starting to be like some sort of like rules of thumb about the way that people, law enforcement uses this. And there's certain databases they can go to and they know it. And there's certain databases they're not supposed to be able to get into, or that they can't get into, depending. And you as the consumer are supposed to know how this whole thing operates, which is very hard to know unless you put a lot of research into it. Like, if I feel okay about this, where do I test? And I want my DNA used to find a killer, where do I test? And if I'm really against it, where do I test? Right. So that's a lot of research that you have to do. And then once you test, depending on the place, there may be like an option to opt in or opt out of having your DNA used this way. And then you've got to go through all that. So unless you're super informed about this, if you have strong feelings about it, it's like super hairy to understand what the terrain is. And, I can say some companies have really stringent protections as far as we know, and others don't, but it's also a landscape that changes a great deal. And there may be things we don't know about how this works too.
And on the other side, you talk about eugenics and how it could be used to differentiate people who in future, even though there's a law against it with Gina, the perhaps somebody not getting medical coverage or life insurance or whatever it is in that whole field. So what is your advice for people who are thinking about taking a home DNA test?
Yeah, I mean, I have lived and breathed this question for the last 4 years, right? And I should say, like, I am somebody who is well represented in DNA databases. I and my family are in there. I'm in 3, just myself. And I come at this as somebody who has made specific, pretty amazing genealogical discoveries because of DNA along both of my sides of my family. The discoveries that made my family bigger and the world smaller. And I get the power of it, right? But I'm also someone who's like interviewed a lot of people who they didn't know what it was that they were getting into exactly. And they felt the kind of shell shock of the repercussions. And, most of the people that I interviewed who discovered something surprising about their own genetic origins were ultimately glad to know, because even when it was painful, it was the truth. And that we really value the truth in terms of understanding ourselves. But there's a lot of pain that comes along with that often. Sometimes you're reaching out to your genetic father and your genetic father is rejecting you, or he's saying, that's not true, I'm not your dad. And you can see that he is in the database, and that, so it's a big deal. And I guess I would say, like, it's not something to be entered into lightly. Right. And when you take a test, even though it seems like it is something to be entered into lightly, like, because the marketing makes it seem like it's not a big deal, but it actually can be a really big deal. And you don't know if you're going to be one of those people for whom it's a really big deal, or for whom it's just like, oh, everything was as I expected and it was actually kind of boring. Right. You don't know that until you've done it, and then it's too late. So what a conundrum, right? When you take a test, there's this like a little advisory that you get with a lot of the companies, and it'll say something like, you may discover unexpected relatives. But what I found was that over and over, when I interviewed people who had a surprise, that they didn't think that it applied to them, because it would be kind of almost like bizarre if you did, right? It would be kind of like bizarre if you went into situations thinking, maybe I'm about to discover that everything I was ever told was a lie. Like, we assume that applies to other people and not to us. So that's a bit of a conundrum if you consider that the warnings or the advisories aren't going to hold water. Maybe the advisories could be more emphasized. But I also think, at this point, because so many people are kind of affected by this and impacted by it, even if they've never taken a test, because I think, like, family secrets are essentially over, and we have to rethink how we have these conversations. We have to rethink what the generations think they owe to each other in terms of transparency, like, possibly as a matter of honor, certainly as a matter of inevitability, because it's just we are going there no matter what, right? So I think in a way that the advice that I would give is not in some sense for the people around the DNA test. It's actually for that older generation of people who may have knowledge about how their children came into the world that their children themselves don't know. And the advice would be consider telling your child. Consider looking into the issue, consider getting someone to hold your hand. There are people to help you with it. There are people to help you with the language around it. But imagine if you're in your 80s that you pass on in 10 years and your child finds out then, and they never can come to you with questions for context. People who find out things from a computer screen that their mom didn't tell them often feel quite betrayed. And if you can have that conversation with your mom, and your mom says, listen, like, I held on to this truth because it was incredibly painful, because it was a decision that I made at the time. It made a lot of sense in the context of the world that I lived in, which absolutely many of these decisions did. Most of them were operating in a completely different cultural and moral universe, and so we can't really judge them, based on kind of the contemporary mores. We have to kind of look at why people made the decisions back then. But, if you can say to your child, listen, this is the decision I made, but like, now I want to just talk to you about it and like answer those questions, like that, those conversations often will go a lot better than when the person finds out via DNA test.
Please feel free to put any questions you may have. We have about 10 minutes left here in the chat box. And if you want to share, if you have done a DNA test and which one you use, feel free to share that as well.
Yeah.
Or if you're absolutely against it and you think it's a terrible thing that's going on, that it is a breach of privacy or for other reasons, we'd love to hear that too. So you've talked about some of the big industry leaders, Ancestry.com in your book, and 23andMe, and the future of, what do you see as the future? You've talked about so many people, privacy issues. What's on the landscape?
So the biggest companies are Ancestry and 23andMe. And they have the lion's share of the databases at this point. So they're kind of the ones that are, kind of pointing the way toward the future. So 23andMe has, I think, about 12 million people in their database, and Ancestry has about 20 million people. So that's like most of it right there in those two databases. And those two companies are going in different directions as far as how they see the future of this industry, which is really interesting. 23andMe has always felt from the beginning of its founding that the future of this is health research and healthcare and understanding the genetic underpinnings of disease. And that is both, they will say helpful to humanity, but also much more lucrative, and what happens when you take a test with 23andMe is they'll ask you, are you comfortable with having your DNA used to conduct, research into the genetics of certain diseases? If you're okay with that, we will protect your information. We're going to anonymize it and aggregate it and bundle it and so you'll be protected. But like, what do you think? And a lot of their consumers say yes, because there's this sense of like, well, as long as my privacy is protected, listen, if you can find something in my DNA that helps cure some obscure disease that might affect my grandchildren, like, go for it, that's kind of. And so that you see them following that kind of model, and they recently went public and they were valued at several $1 billion. And so that's kind of where they're taking it. And then you see Ancestry, they actually dipped their toe into this world and backed away. And they're seem to be doubling down on the idea that they are really selling this product for the purposes of family history research. And their advertising is really always hitting those notes of, this idea of self-discovery. And understanding America's history better through DNA testing. And they sell subscription access to genealogical archives, and they're constantly doing that. That's a big part of their business model, is selling those subscriptions, right? So the DNA test kit may not be much money. It might be $59 on sale at Ancestry. And the hope on their part is that it acts as a kind of gateway drug to get you obsessed with genealogy, right? So it becomes a backdoor. It used to be the opposite. It used to be people were into genealogy and then they got into DNA testing. Now we see it operating the other way around. And I say gateway drug because, genealogy is really addictive, right? I'm using it in a light fashion, but there are not enough stories of genealogical obsessives to, in this book, to represent all the stories that I heard of people who are just completely obsessed with genealogy, right? It's like this amazing, riveting pastime. And I get it. And Ancestry, I think, is counting on the fact that they're just going to be able to kind of combine those two things and really kind of double down on the family history angle. So I don't know where it's going. You see two different models there.
So you have spent, obviously you're passionate about this topic. And again, I'm going to put a plug in for your book. It's beautifully researched and written, very compelling the way you use both information and story to move us along. And I just loved it. And also I've listened to part of it on the e-audio, and a great reader for e-audio as well.
Actor. She's really, really good.
Yeah.
This is my first book, and I got to listen to the auditions. I didn't know you get to do that as the author. And I got to say, this is the woman who should be doing the book. And then they hired her. So it was really cool. She's great.
That's great. Yeah, it's very enjoyable. So if you don't have it or aren't purchasing the book and you want to get it through your library, it's on the Hoopla app.
Mm-hmm.
I also want to make a plug for libraries with the Ancestry and other genealogy databases. So many people don't realize that the typical local public library has the access to lots of databases, and some of them you can use remotely. You usually get a stronger reach database to when you go into the library and physically do it. And here at Gail Borden, we have a nice setup and lots of microfilm too. As you talk about in your genealogy with the seekers, there's so many records out there that are being digitized. So what are you working on next that you're passionate about?
Yeah. And someone, since there's a question in the Q&A box, thank you for letting us know. We'll go to that. Yeah, I actually have a magazine story coming out tomorrow in AARP magazine. So I'm pretty excited about that. And I won't say what it is because it hasn't been published yet, but it's got these themes of it's got some DNA and it's got some investigation and it's got a wonderful, really compelling character who in many ways reminds me of Alice because he's very methodical and intelligent and scientific minded. So that's, if you get AARP or you look online, that'll be out tomorrow, the 29th. Yeah, I guess I'll be looking for more stories that are true stories that read like thrillers, because that's, Alice's story and this latest story that I did in the magazine. And just like in general, those are the kind of stories that speak to me, right? Where we, have a compelling person with an incredibly fascinating personality and their full humanity that we can relate to. But there's also this story that you can't put down. And that's the kind of stories I love to tell. So I'm looking for my next one.
Great.
And somebody wrote here about genealogy. It is addicted. I've personally tested about 10 family members, and then plenty of other cousins have tested on their own. And we're spread across lots of places, and you're fishing in different ponds. Many of our best matches only tested one site. Do you have a favorite site? I mean, I don't endorse a site over another, right? Because it's kind of awkward for me as a journalist, but I will say usually when I, talk to search angels at this point, they used to talk about fishing in 3 ponds, right? You use that pond language. They used to talk about multiple databases. Now they're just doing Ancestry because Ancestry is so big that, you basically hit a rock and you find a first cousin or a half sister or something like that. So I think, as the databases have gotten bigger, it's just gotten easier and easier in those bigger databases to find close cousins.
And then you have a question in the Q&A here. What is your thought on DNA testing outing past indiscretions? My dad believes that things should be well enough left alone, that people had reasons for their choices, and without being here to defend those choices, our memories of them are sullied. It's an interesting perspective and one I can understand.
Yeah, no, I mean, that absolutely makes sense to me. I mean, these situations are really complicated. And it sounds like this particular question is talking about people who aren't alive anymore to contextualize their decisions, right? Either their decision that led to, say, the birth of a child, or their decision to not talk about the circumstances through which that child came into the world. So both of those things, right? You're absolutely right. And I sympathize with that perspective. And I think, people have to approach these situations with a whole lot of grace and compassion for one another, because, what we're dealing with here is in many ways the collision of different cultures. We're talking about the culture of the present intersecting with the culture of the past. And the past was a foreign country. It was a really different place, even 60, 70 years ago. And I'm not even talking about what your grandparents' generation, which is even more different, right? So yeah, I think, in families, often there's got to be a lot of forbearance. Sometimes you read the room and you know that you're not going to tell. You're not going to talk to certain people about it, or you kind of float it. And you see how people respond, are you interested in what the research I've done on grandma's family? Nope. Okay. And you can often sort of tell. There's a technique that somebody talked about when you're connecting with someone, in a database, and maybe they're a close relation and you're not sure if they know that you exist or how you're related, or if they understand that the context of your relationship may involve a family surprise. There's this kind of approach of just kind of giving the littlest bit of information, then seeing how they respond. Like not a whole long letter of, oh my God, I see we're long lost half sisters, it must mean, but more like, hey, I see how we're related. Do you want to explore our connection? And then let them take the lead. Because over and over, what I found and what other people told me is that in these discoveries, agency is very important. Like, in other words, being able to control the process and control the experience of making these discoveries and the timeline, that matters a lot. And different members of a family will be on different timelines. And if you force your revelation or your truth on someone else, it makes them feel like they didn't have power over the process, and they're more likely to kind of reject the news because they haven't had the chance to kind of own it and get to know it and process it and maybe do their own research. So that seems to be a big part of it too, is kind of like allowing the other person to kind of dictate the pace. If the sort of almost like the slowest person dictates the pace of these kind of conversations.
That's great advice. We really appreciate you meeting us at Gale Borden Public Library this evening, Libby, and I hope your book continues to get lots of good accolades.
So
again, that you're going to see this backwards and from the Zoom, but I highly recommend it to everyone. I hope that you'll get a chance to read it, listen to it, or purchase it for a family member, as I'll be doing myself. So thank you so much for joining us all the way from New York. Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. And it's been absolutely my privilege being here. And I love this chat. I mean, great points about giving people time and space. Oh, thank you. Your book is good. I appreciate it. Your check is in the mail. Thank you for being here. This is the highlight of my week, is talking to people who are interested in this topic and these themes, which is a lot of Americans right now. So this is absolutely my privilege. So thank you for having me.
Great. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Have a good night, everyone. And thank you, Sadia.
Thank you.
Thank you, both of you.
Thank you. Good night.